Welcome to this evening's talk, Genes, Jews and Jnetics. I'm going to just give a brief introduction to Jnetics, the charity, and then pass you along to Rabbi Weitzman. Jnetics, as you may know, is the only charity working towards the prevention of Jewish genetic disorders. We screen for 9 severe and devastating disorders that have no cure, can all be prevented by carrier screening, which we will be hearing more about from Rabbi Weitzman. We were set up 10 years ago to fill a gap in the UK community. Around the world, Jewish communities have used carrier screening programs to help eradicate severe Jewish genetic disorders. But at the time we were set up, there was nothing like this in the UK. Our aim is simple. Make sure that any Jewish individuals or couples who are going to have kids now or in the future are aware of their risk of passing on a severe disorder and have access to responsible and affordable carrier screening. Through our Genius program, we do educational awareness raising work in different settings, schools, university, outreach to GPs, and in community settings like this. We also work with all the synagogue movements and rabbis to make sure screening information is provided to all couples going through the pre-marriage process. Our screening is delivered in partnership with the NHS, who provide the genetic counselling aspect of the service and ensure that anyone who's identified as a carrier or carrier couple is streamlined into the NHS system and can get any support they may need. Since setting up our screening services in 2014, we've managed to screen over 3,500 people. Even during the pandemic, we've continued to deliver our screening clinic virtually, with over 100 people getting screened in the last couple of months. But our work is ongoing. We want to make sure that these disorders are totally eradicated from the community. It may sound ambitious, but it's achievable, and events like this that raise awareness are one step towards this goal. This evening's talk is being recorded and photos may be taken and used in the future, just to let everyone know. After the talk, there'll be a Q&A, which we won't be recording. If you wish to ask anything, please press participants and then use the raise hand feature. If you've seen that before in Zoom, we'll unmute you or put the question, or if you want to just type a question into the chat, please do that, or you can send a private one to Gabby, who's labeled Jnetics questions. Juliet, who's a genetic counsellor, is also available to answer questions later on. Now you know a bit more about us. Let me introduce Rabbi Weitzman. He was born in England, moved to Israel, and received rabbinic ordination from the Israeli Chief Rabbinate, and an MA from Yeshiva University. He was Rosh Kollel in Kansas City and taught in numerous places around the world. He's a director of PUAH, the Institute for Fertility and Halacha, where he counsels thousands of couples worldwide in areas of fertility, genetics, intimacy, high-risk pregnancies, and other related subjects. He's the rabbi of Merkaz Modayin community in Modayin and writes a popular weekly column on fertility and halacha in Torah Tidbits and the Jewish Press. He's published numerous articles and book chapters on fertility, as well as 4 books on the philosophy of Rav Kook. He's married to Rivka, and they have 6 children and 1 grandson. Rabbi Weitzman, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Greg, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for all that you do to help the Jewish community, which is what we're doing together. That, I think, brings us together, in that we're all trying to help the Jewish community. I have a talk. We don't have a tremendous amount of time, but I called it From Moses to Mendel, because I think that's what we're interested in, is how the relationship between the Jewish view and the current scientific view as well. And we're going to speak a little bit about genetic testing. So Mendel was basically was a monk in Austria in the 19th century, had a lot of time on his hands. He grew thousands of pea plants, and he discovered that there were traits that were sort of expressed from generation to generation, but skipped out generations, and he called it he published his writings. It was completely ignored, and 50 years later it was rediscovered. And at the beginning of the 20th century, we started having what we call Mendelian inheritance. And OMIM, which is online Mendelian inheritance as man, is really named after Mendel. Mendel really was the founder of what we call modern genetics. What interested me as a rabbi and as someone who studied the Talmud for many years is that the Talmud already speaks about genetics on some level. Says the Talmud, there are three partners in the creation of man: God, his father, and his mother. And that's a very well-known Talmudic expression. But what's interesting is the continuation of the Talmud. The father gives the white stuff, from which comes the bones, the sinews, the fingernails, brain, and the white of the eyes. The mother gives the red stuff, from which comes the skin, the flesh, the hair, the pupil in the eye. And God gives the spirit, the soul, the countenance, etc. Now, we don't think actually that it's so simple that the husband gives the white stuff and the wife gives the red stuff. But what is interesting here is that both characters, both partners, indeed contribute genetic material. And why that's interesting is that not so long ago, it was thought that there was no such thing as an infertile man. There were only infertile women. In fact, in the English language, an infertile woman is called barren. There is no male equivalent for barren in the English language. There is in Hebrew. In Hebrew, we have akar and akara, who are fertile and infertile men and women. But the reason was in that as Hertzkauer drew here in 1694, the sperm cell really was a little human being, and that all the genetic came from the man and nothing came from the woman. So the fact that a Talmud already says that the woman contributes genetic material in itself was an incredibly astronomical idea and an unusual idea that already was written 2,000 years ago. But this is the case that I wanted to speak about a little bit. A woman circumcised her son and he died. In a terrible incident, that the son died because of the circumcision. The second child also died, and she should not circumcise the third child, says Rabbi Gideon Weitzman. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says she should circumcise the third, but not the fourth. What are they talking about? So it's hard to guess Talmudic medicine, but maybe they're talking about hemophilia. Because hemophilia, all of us, I hope, who don't have hemophilia, I hope everybody here and everybody that we know doesn't have hemophilia, we have something called factor VIII in our blood, which causes platelets and causes a plug and causes a scar and stops us bleeding to death. But if you have hemophilia, then unfortunately what will happen is that a minor incision, like a circumcision, in which we're making a incision and cutting the skin, the foreskin, will continue to bleed possibly until it is fatal. And so if these children had hemophilia, it's likely, since it's a genetic abnormality, that one child will have that occurrence, and that'll happen in the next child and in the next child. What the Talmud does not say is, let's see whether child number 3 has that fatal disease. We assume that there's a genetic component to that illness, and therefore we don't circumcise that child. And we know indeed that hemophilia is what's called an X-linked genetic abnormality. It's carried on the X gene. The most famous family to have hemophilia in the 20th century, of course, was the Russian royal family. They were all cousins, all married into each other. And the women all carried this X-linked genetic abnormality. Their women were carriers. Their sons were unhealthy. The sons died. And came a guy and said, I can heal you. And his name was Rasputin. And the rest is Russian history. And it's because of this disease, because of hemophilia, that was already mentioned in the Talmud 2,000 years ago. And then it gets exciting, because there was a case of 4 sisters in Sipori. Sipori is the cedar where Rabbi Gideon, the prince, lived. That the first circumcised and died, the second died, and the third also died. I.e., there were 3 sisters. And anybody who looks at the cultural reference, the picture at the back is a band in the 70s called the 4 Sisters. That's why the cultural reference here, that's the picture. And the 4 sisters, 1, 2, 3, had this genetic abnormality. The 4th sister, who's had no children, who has not suffered this, came to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, we just heard about him before, and he told her, don't circumcise since, and here comes the crutch, sisters have a probability, i.e., what do we call that? There is a chance that there's a genetic abnormality that is carried from sister to sister, or in a family, a familial genetic abnormality. And in fact, that's exactly what happens with hemophilia or with any other genetic abnormality, is that we have it in a family, and we would, if you come to a genetic counselor, as as Jnetics have, and other other genetic counselors, they will make a genetic tree, and they'll take your family tree and say, okay, if you have a grandfather that's got this and a grandmother that's got this, so the chance of you having this disease are 1 in 12 or 1 in 10 or 1 in 5 or 1 in whatever it is, and then we'll work it out. And that's exactly the job of genetic counselor. Who was the first? This is now a quiz, a popular Trivial Pursuit quiz. Who was the first genetic counselor in the world? The answer would be Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, because Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is exactly what he does. He says, what is the chance of this fourth child, this cousin, getting this disease? Because let's look at this. Let's look at that family tree. If we have 3 sisters who are all carriers of this X-linked genetic abnormality, the chance of the fourth sister is incredibly high. So high that let's not circumcise the child. And that idea that the rabbis, they couldn't call it Mendelian inheritance, they didn't call it genes, they didn't know about chromosomes, they didn't know about recessive or dominant genetic abnormalities. But what they did understand is there are familial traits that are passed from family to family, and we need to be careful of them. That's that's an incredibly advanced understanding of genetics for people 2,000 years ago. There's 2 other sources, and then I want to dive into what genetics is and how we can solve it, and why you should go and do genetic testing. A person, says the Talmud, should not marry a woman from a family of nichvim or a family of Metzoraim. It's hard to translate that word. That's why we left it in Hebrew. However, it seems to be epilepsy. We shouldn't marry a family from someone who comes from a family of him, not a person who has epilepsy. In the family of this person, and the Talmud says 3 cases that appeared in one family, there is a chance that that will affect the person who seems to be unaffected because maybe they are a carrier. So be careful of this family of nichvim. There's a beautiful piece of Talmud that says a tall man should not marry a tall woman lest they have a flagpole, like a very, very tall child. A short man should not marry a short woman lest they have a finger, like a tiny little kid. A light man should not marry a light woman lest they have a very pale child. And a dark man should not marry a dark woman lest they have a very dark child. Being tall, short, light, or dark are not genetic diseases. They are genetic components. They are genetic propensities. And therefore, the trait of being tall or short or light or dark is not a problem other than they become amplified over generations. And when we have a small gene pool like us Jews have, we are likely to increase the chances of having a genetic problem, a genetic abnormality, in this case a trait, but it could be also a disease that is likely to be amplified as we go from generation to generation, going back from the founder gene, from the founder family or the founder individual who was the first person to have that genetic mutation. And the Talmud clearly understood that that was a concern. So what are genes? It's very important to understand that genes are not the things that make us sick. Everybody tells us, what do genes do? They make us sick. That's not true. Genes carry sometimes diseases, but they also carry a lot of tremendously important information. So genes carry the map of how we're going to look. What is going to be the differentiation of our cells? How is our body going to be formed out of these cells, out of these even smaller levels of the letters, as it were, that comprise the chapters that make our body, that make the volumes that are the chromosomes that are our body. And we receive 23 chromosomes from the egg, 23 from the sperm, and we have a full component of 46 chromosomes, which is a map. On that map will also be, here we have the chromosomes. The first contains more information than the second, than the third, and the fourth. They're called, very uninterestingly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, until you get to the last chromosomes with the X and Y, which is whether you're male or female or somewhat in between. What is important is that those genes also contain sometimes a code for disease. So let's take gene 15, which is a very important gene for us Ashkenazi Jews, because on there we have Tay-Sachs, which is the most common genetic abnormality in our community. But we also have other things, Bloom syndrome, Marfan syndrome, other genetic abnormalities. And today we have mapped the gene. We know where those markers are. We could identify them and tell you where on your gene this disease could potentially sit, could potentially form a child or a human being who will have this abnormality, this disease, or this propensity to disease. When they first started mapping genes several decades ago. My brother, who's a geneticist, was working at the time in the Salk Institute in San Diego. And they had a special that instead of costing $2,000 to map your whole gene, you could do it for $500. So he thought that was worth it, and he has his gene map. Now it's much, much cheaper, but that was what was at the time. And a woman in his community in San Diego said, that's great, I'm also going to do that. I'll map my gene. And he said, why would you want to do that? She said, well, I'll find out all about information. He said, what information do you want to know? She said, well, I guess I'll find I have a propensity to disease. I'll know that I have a possibility of getting sick. He said, and what will you do with that information? She said, well, I guess if I know that I could get sick, I'll eat more healthy, I'll do more exercise. He said, lady, I can save you $2,000 now. Eat more healthy, do more exercise, that's always good. I.e., the idea that I'm going to get a disease is sometimes important, not always. But sometimes if we have a very fatal disease or a debilitating disease, that can be very important information to know. And if we don't know that, that can be, unfortunately, very, very harmful. Of course, the actual diversity that we have is very, very small. Most of 99.999% of all our genes are the same. The code is basically the same to make anybody in this picture, and even anybody in this picture. They're all pretty much the same genetically. And in fact, even identical twins have slight differences in their genes, but slight differences can be very important, because sometimes one letter change can be very, very important. This is a road in Israel called Alexandroni. It's translated in English in Alex Androni. That's clearly not what it means. Alexandroni is from Alexandria. Alex Androni are just two guys who happen probably to live in the street. And so that's a funny mistake that we all could work out. But this is a street called Agdud HaIvri, and if you notice carefully, you'll notice that in fact there are several mistakes on that sign. It's actually amazing to think that there are professional sign makers who make such mistakes. There's a mistake in the Hebrew, in the English, and in the Arabic. Now, you probably didn't notice that because our mind would read that as Agdud HaIvri, and we would ignore that. And it's probably nothing too bad would happen. However, there are sometimes one-letter mistakes that can make a big difference. There is a huge difference between exiting vehicles and exciting vehicles. And if you're supposed to give way to exciting vehicles, that is already a judgment call which vehicle is exciting and which is not. Exiting vehicles is clearly a objective understanding. That can be very, very important. And in fact, we have genetic abnormalities that are one letter, such as Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome is very characteristic, long limbs, this characteristic face, tall, which is also will lead to muscle wasting and to eventually a very crippling disease. The most famous person who suffered from Marfan syndrome in the past 200 years is this guy, Abraham Lincoln. He didn't die from Marfan syndrome, it should be noted now. He died because someone shot him in the head. But Marfan syndrome, he did suffer from, and that's why he was incredibly tall and had this very long arms and this very characteristic face. And basically, we have now, as we said, mapped every single chromosome, every single chapter of that book to say where the diseases are. That's incredibly important information, and we can use that to prevent these diseases being passed on. Let's talk about a little bit about that. There are some diseases that are de novo, that are not hereditary, but are on a chromosomal level. For example, trisomy 21. I had a couple in my office this afternoon who a woman is pregnant with a child who has trisomy 21 that is called Down syndrome. That is not something that is hereditary, that's passed from generation to generation, but is something that is a de novo that just happens and in the way of the meeting between the sperm and the egg. We can have trisomies on all of the chromosomes. We can have monosomies where we have only one. We can have a tetraploidy. And in fact, as a woman gets older, with an increased maternal age, we have a likelihood of having aneuploidy. Those are genetic abnormalities that are not inherited from generation to generation, but are just the abnormality of the formation of the egg. That's important to know as well, that not all genetic abnormalities are inherited, they're not all hereditary, and therefore we can't prevent all of them. If a woman gets older, there's a likelihood of having genetic abnormalities. But some of them we can. The autosomal recessive genetic diseases are diseases such as Tay-Sachs, in which in order to get sick, both parties have to contribute a affected chromosome. If you only have half of them, you will be a carrier. So just Tay-Sachs. In Tay-Sachs, to be a carrier means that I'm perfectly healthy, but there's 1 in 4 chance that my children will inherit from myself and my wife, who are both carriers, the genetic abnormality. As opposed to a dominant genetic abnormality that is so powerful that it doesn't matter whether you have half of it or the whole complement, it's the same thing. You can't be a carrier. You get it and you are sick. And you have 50% chance of passing it on to your children as well. There's also, as we mentioned before, X-linked genetic abnormalities, which are carried on the X chromosome. The women generally are healthy because they have another X chromosome to balance out the affected X chromosome. And the children, there's male children, if they inherit that affected X chromosome, have no other X chromosome, they will be sick, such as we said before, hemophilia or Fragile X or others. So a few years ago, there was an organization, there was a young man in Brooklyn whose son died of Tay-Sachs. His name was Eckstein. And he said, there's no reason this should happen again. Let's go and test everybody. Let's do exactly what Jnetics is doing. Let's go and test every single person and see, do they have genetic abnormalities or not? And let's see if they have Tay-Sachs. They went to all the rabbis, and the rabbis said, no. Rabbi Feinstein said, you can't do that. Why? So you have to see whether you were listening to the talk before. Because we said, don't marry a woman from a family of nichvim, or we'll call it now terms, a tainted family, a carrier family. Don't marry such a woman. And you're going to create more and more tainted families. You're going to create more and more families that are unmarriageable. Why? Because we're going to find out they're carriers and no one's going to want to marry them. And so Eckstein came up with a brilliant idea. His idea was, let's have a serial number. You won't get an answer. You'll get a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when you come to think about getting married, you'll go to the database and you say, I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and my potential spouse is 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, and it goes into the database and we'll check it out and we'll say either Mazel Tov or sorry, the shidduch's off. That's not a good match. And Dor Yesharim did an incredible revolution in the world in that they got people to check genetic components or before they got married, premarital genetic screening. Dor Yesharim is amazing. It has certain flaws. One of the flaws it has is it's really good for Ashkenazim or Sfardim. It's not good for a combination. I have the merit of having some of my children are married to Ashkenazim. I'm Ashkenazi. Some of them are married to Sfardim. I have a grandson who's sort of 1/8 Sfardi, and this is already the reality in our community, that we don't only separate Ashkenazim and Sfardim. They have a very limited panel, and there's a much greater panel that we can have. It's also the very significant difference between what we call closed testing, where you don't get the answer, and what is suggested today, which is basically open testing. What Dor Yesharim did is they opened the door to having open testing. And they continue to have closed testing, but they enable us to understand, as exactly as Greg said before, the importance of the knowledge, of the awareness that it's important to know about these genetic abnormalities and potentially to stop them happening. Stop them happening by not marrying another person as a carrier, or in other ways that we'll talk about in a moment. It definitely serves a purpose, Dor Yesharim, not maybe in the community of the people who are attending today. It's the first, and not always the first is not always the best, and therefore there are other things we can do. We can do a genetic counselor. A genetic counselor will sit with us and say, what is your family background? Tell me about your ethnic background, but also your specific background. What are the chances of you having a certain genetic abnormality, and what therefore should we be testing? And there are many. J-Screen is in America. Jnetics is the sponsor tonight. And basically, we're looking at the common genetic abnormalities in the Ashkenazi community. You should know that Ashkenazim win the race of the most diseases of any ethnic group in the world. We won. We are the most ethnic diseases. And the reason is, as we said before, we maintained a small gene pool, a small pool of people who are marrying each other. And we did that for generations, for even millennia in some cases. And therefore, we have amplified the genetic abnormalities and the genetic traits that we have. And therefore, if you look at the full comport of these are in certain things in Ashkenazim, in Sfardim, in Moroccans, in Iraqi Jews. But if you look at the whole comport, there are hundreds of diseases that appear in the Jewish community. And we can prevent them. We can prevent them by knowing about them, by knowing that they exist, And if we don't stop marriages, we can also do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. We're able today to identify, here's a gene that is problematic, and we don't need to pass that on. So a couple may get married who are both carriers of Tay-Sachs, and what they would be able to do is they'd be able to develop embryos inside the lab. And this is a little bit of history of how we've been doing PGD for many years, and maybe I think several decades already. And we started doing it very simple. Now we have what's called next generation sequencing, where we have a great amount of information, sometimes too much information, that we enable them to see what is an affected embryo and what is what we would possibly think of as a perfect embryo. And that is we can only do that if we know that we have a genetic disease. We don't have to wait until we have a child born who's sick. We can do that testing already before, especially for those known genetic diseases. And so what should we be doing PGD for? What should we be testing for? Those are very big questions. We said that we set out with a spec, and our spec was several questions. What are genes and how can they affect me? Well, we just heard. Genes are the map of what you and I and everybody's going to look like. How can they affect my children? Well, they're going to affect my children. If I've got ginger hair, I'm probably going to have children with ginger hair because that's a very dominant genetic trait. If I have children who have, if I have a certain genetic trait that is very prominent, very powerful, that's likely that my children will inherit that. If that's having ginger hair or no hair, that's not so terrible. We can probably live with baldness and we can probably live with ginger hair. However, if we have a genetic abnormality that is a disease such as Tay-Sachs, in which the body is incapable of breaking down fatty acids and therefore leading to a terrible, horrible fatality at a very early age, and we could prevent that, then we're obligated to prevent it. I told you before that the rabbis were very much against Eckstein's original idea. What happened after Eckstein came up with Doi Sharim and with this sequence number, all of the rabbis said the exact opposite. In fact, Rabbi Feinstein, who we saw his picture before, who was very much against it initially, wrote a very, very fascinating answer. He wrote a very fascinating response. So someone has asked him. He said the following. He said, you know, there is a verse that says we should be pure with God. We should be tamim. We should be innocent with God. And he said, but if you know something could happen and you don't prevent it and you close your eyes to it, that's not being innocent. That's being stupid. And I give the example every time that if I'm talking to you from Jerusalem and I'm about to go home back to my house in Modi'in, there's a highway that takes us back, the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway. If I would get into the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway and I would drive up, but I would blindfold myself because I believe in God, I'm innocent. I believe in God. I go with God's plan. I have 100% faith. And after a minute, of course, the police would pull me over and they would say, are you crazy? I would say, no, I am full of faith. They would say, that's very nice. That you can tell the judge. They'd be brought before the judge and I probably would be fined very seriously, if not sit in jail. There are certain things, say the rabbis, that if I could know and the results are disastrous and I close my eyes, then I'm not being full of faith, I'm being stupid. And that's, I think, we asked, what did God want us to do? What can be done? What we can do is we can genetically test. We can prevent problematic marriages. Certain things, marriages are not always the answer. That's only for recessive genetic abnormalities. For dominant genetic abnormalities, for familial genetic abnormalities, for unusual genetic abnormalities, and for excellent genetic abnormalities, the right or wrong marriage doesn't always help us. And then we have the possibilities we said, as we just presented, of having pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Is that what God wants us to do? Well, I have a question. I pose it to you, and that we'll finish with. When and I sit with many people who have complex genetic questions and complex genetic diagnosis. And the question was always, well, if God gave us this sick baby, or God made us this disease, or God gave us this genetic abnormality, that's what we should live with. And I said, if God wanted that to happen, you would have been born 50 years ago. You would have been born before there was genetics, before there was Doi Sharim, before there was genetic testing, and you would have not known about it. You would have had the child would have been born, and he would unfortunately die a very horrible death in front of your eyes. God made you born in this generation and way we have the opportunity to test. When we look at God's gifts to the world, one of them, of course, is just the fact that we're alive, that we have genetics, that we're mostly healthy. But another gift that God has given us is the advances of medicine, is the ability to test, is the understanding of what we can see, we need to see. What we don't know about, that maybe we should let lie. But what we do know about, what we can prevent and what we can do something about, that's something that we have an obligation as believing people, as people who believe, as a ethnic group that we have, the Jews, that God has helped us and guided us through history. Then our obligation is to use the gifts that God has given us, use them wisely. We shouldn't abuse them and to try to create a superhuman being. That would be a disaster. That would be terrible. But if we use them to try to get a healthy human being, to try to create children that are not genetically perfect, but do not carry known genetic diseases, then that is, I think, what God really wants from us. And so I thank you very, very much. I can only see you clapping, but I can't hear anybody clapping. That's a very interesting experience that happened.
Thank you. Sorry, it's a Zoom thing.
Thank you, Rabbi Weitzman. That was amazing. Really, really interesting. We learned so much. I'm sure everybody learned so much.